Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we begin our discussion of industrialization. You should recall that earlier this year, we discussed the events of the Industrial Revolution. So let's start with a quick recap. The Industrial Revolution was a series of improvements in industrial technology that transformed the process of manufacturing goods. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most goods were made in relatively small quantities using hand tools or very simple machines for local consumption. But in the late 1700s, in the rural English Midlands, a shift began to occur toward production using power-driven machinery, like the steam engine. And eventually, this concept diffused out of Britain. Industrialization began to occur throughout Western Europe and North America in the 19th century. Many countries of the semi-periphery industrialized during the 20th century, and some are still industrializing today. But why did the Industrial Revolution begin when and where it did? In short, there are two reasons: access to natural resources and new technological innovations. The British Midlands had abundant natural resources that were used in early industrialization. Rushing rivers and timber from forests served as energy for early industry. But perhaps most importantly for the British was the abundance of coal, seen here in shades of red and yellow. The abundance of natural resources is useful, but it was the new technological innovations that emerged that made it possible for a revolution to occur. Thomas Newcomen invented the steam engine, but it was inefficient and required an abundant fuel source: coal. But when James Watt improved the steam engine, it made it possible to power huge moving machines in massive factories. And as the steam engine was applied to new innovations in transportation, like the locomotive, the locations of manufacturing were less constrained. Factory owners could build factories away from the coal pits and have the natural resources transported in. Well, this obviously necessitated improvements in transportation systems. Canals, or man-made waterways, were built throughout England. In addition, an extensive rail network was built. And the physical geography of England assisted in both of these matters, as there were many rivers and coastlines to aid in the construction of canals, as well as a flat landscape that was conducive to building miles of railroad tracks. But the construction of locomotives and a rail network required more coal, as well as raw materials like iron ore, which can be processed into a finished good called iron. And since coal burns hotter and longer than wood or a wood product like charcoal, it made it possible to use iron as the basic component in a stronger metal, steel. So it was the fact that abundant energy sources like coal intersected with new technologies, chief among them the steam engine, that created the environment for the Industrial Revolution to occur. New innovations weren't limited to the steam engine and locomotive. New agricultural innovations like steam-powered tractors and harvesters, as well as mechanical seed drills, emerged during this period as well. Remember, the Industrial Revolution and the Second Agricultural Revolution overlapped and intertwined. As a result, agricultural output greatly increased. With abundant and cheaper food, famines became less common in England. When this was combined with improvements in medicine and sanitation, mortality rates began to fall. Declining death rates launched Great Britain into stage 2 of the demographic transition, and the population boomed. In fact, the population of Great Britain jumped from about 10 million around 1800 to nearly 40 million a century later. And it wasn't just that death rates were declining, people were living longer lives. So development metrics like infant and child mortality rates declined, while life expectancy increased. With inventions like the locomotive, as well as improved transportation systems like canals and better roads, factory owners were able to choose where to open new factories. And urban areas were a logical choice because they were near potential customers as well as an abundant labor force. At the same time, rural farmland was being consolidated through the Enclosure Acts, and productivity was increasing due to mechanization of farm work. So there were fewer primary sector jobs and fewer places to live in rural areas. As a result, rural to urban migration increased dramatically, leading to unprecedented urban populations and expansion of secondary sector employment as more people began to work in factories. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, over 80% of the British population was rural. By 1850, more than 50% lived in cities. A majority of Americans lived in cities by 1900. France's urban population rose from 25% in the early 1800s to 44% by the early 1900s. In Germany, the urban population doubled from 30% to 60% during that same time period. And it should be noted, it wasn't just people moving to established cities like London, but also the transformation of small towns like Manchester into major industrial cities. In fact, by 1820, Manchester's population had increased nearly 1,000% to 180,000 people. The rapid growth of urban populations eventually ushered in the third stage of the demographic transition. Families realized that their children were more likely to survive infancy, and that meant greater costs to raise them in an urban setting. So birth rates began to decline, and the overall population growth would begin to slow. And the changes don't end there. There were societal changes as well. Between the wealthy and the working classes, a new middle class emerged. These were people who owned shops or practiced law, physicians and educators, bank tellers and artisans. They earned a salary rather than the wages like factory workers and farm laborers, so they could afford some luxuries while also sending their children to school and enjoying a more comfortable lifestyle. But by the 1800s, industrialization of European states became intertwined with colonialism, and the two processes fueled one another. Industrialization diffused to Northwest Europe by the middle of the 1800s, and colonialism, which had begun in the 15th century, accelerated with improvements in industrial power. European and other industrialized countries like the United States and Japan used colonialism and imperialism to find sources of raw materials and establish exclusive access to new markets. For example, the textile industry was the primary industry during British industrialization, but the British had to look to other parts of the world for a source of raw cotton. India, Egypt, and Sudan were colonized and used to provide cotton for the British textile industry. The French claimed much of West Africa for cotton and palm oil plantations, while Belgium claimed equatorial Africa to secure sources of raw rubber. Other industrializing states in Europe sought out colonies for other raw materials like copper, gold, cacao, sugar, and coffee. With the development of railroads and steamships, it became more economically possible to ship huge quantities of raw materials from other continents to be processed in factories in Europe. These colonies also served as new markets because the industrialized colonizers exerted exclusive control over their colonies. Raw materials were processed in European factories and then transported back to be sold in markets around the world, especially in their colonies. Laborers used the money earned from the sale of raw materials to buy imported manufactured goods. And the Berlin Conference of 1884 demonstrated the lengths that European governments were willing to go to gain control of distant colonies. This was all made possible through the mass production of finished goods. The first industrial revolution was powered by steam, coal, and water power, and was focused on the textile, iron, and coal industries. But later industrial revolutions utilized alternative sources of energy combined with new innovations. The development of steel and petroleum paved the way for the second industrial revolution, which was powered by electricity and the use of the assembly line. This allowed for goods to be mass produced. Mass production is the production of large quantities of a standardized article, often used in assembly line techniques. This allowed manufacturers to capitalize on economies of scale to generate a greater profit. Remember, by producing larger numbers of the goods in high demand, the average cost per unit of that good goes down. By the early 20th century, a man named Henry Ford developed a system where an item was passed from worker to worker along an assembly line. This became known as Fordism, which is a form of mass production in which each worker is assigned one specific task to perform repeatedly. This contributed to the decline of skilled labor, but also became the dominant mode of mass production, particularly after World War II. This period was also marked by a surge in mass consumption because the price per unit had declined due to economies of scale. So for the first time, many customers were able to buy a car from the Henry Ford Company. Eventually, though, automation would allow companies to replace workers with machines. The workers who don't lose their jobs are often trained to do more than one job, so they can rotate among multiple workstations during a workday. These changes will serve as the basis for contemporary changes to manufacturing that we are going to examine in a future lecture. Have a good evening, everyone. I'll see you back in class.